Hey everybody, this is Mike Oppenheim, and you are listening to Coffin Talk, Interviews with the Living, a weekly podcast that explores how our views on death affect the way we live our life. This week, our guest comes to us from Los Angeles. His name is Curtis Chin. He's a co-founder of the Asian American Writers Workshop in New York City, and he served as the nonprofit's first executive director. He went on to write for network and cable television before transitioning to social justice documentaries. He has screened his films at over 600 venues in 16 countries, and he's written for CNN, Bon Appetit, the Detroit Free Press, and the Emancipator Boston Globe. And his memoir, Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant, was published in 2023. I should also add that my brother is a huge fan, and he just saw you recently, and he is almost done with your memoir, so he's begged me to ask you certain questions, and we'll see if we have time for them. But with no further delays,
Okay.
how's it going, Curtis?
Great. Thanks for inviting me to be on your show. Look
Yeah,
forward
definitely.
to an interesting conversation today.
Yeah, me too. I'm excited. He sent me some excerpts from your memoir, and I read a couple of them, and they were fantastic. I'm also a writer, and I also run a writing workshop here in Phoenix, so it's very cool to meet a fellow author. But your memoir is totally fascinating, and it's a subject I care a lot about because it's about culture and food, and also the city of Detroit. So let's start there. We usually ask our guests, how old are you, where were you born, and what generation, if any, do you consider yourself a member of?
Yeah, well, I actually talk about, my origin story in the book where it's 1967, Detroit's going through a very difficult time period, as is much of the country because of racial tensions. For the first time ever, my family's Chinese restaurant had to close for 5 straight days. And during that time period, my parents actually managed to find time to have sex. And 9 months later, I was born as the Riot baby in 1968. And so that's my origin story. And sometimes people ask me, "Oh, why do you talk about racial justice and issues like that so much?" And I'm like, "Well, without that incident, I probably wouldn't be around." So, yeah, that's my background.
That totally makes sense, and that's awesome. Do you think you're a part of a generation here in America, or do you feel like you're not involved in that conversation?
Well, I am part of a generation in a variety of different ways. I mean, my family's been in this country since the 1800s. So there's a bit of distance from that. But in terms of being, Asian American and, the changes that have been going on, like in terms of the civil rights movement, yeah, I definitely feel like I'm part of that generation that really first became aware. But then also as a gay person, I feel like I'm part of the AIDS generation, having grown up in the 80s when, frankly, a lot of people were dying at a very young age. And that really does mark that generation of the gay community.
Exactly, yeah. And your book, it connected me. I mean, you're a great writer. That's the whole,
Thanks.
I don't pick up a book, and if I don't feel like the author's trying to have a relationship with me, it's not very interesting to read it. So I really got that feeling from you. So I'm curious, what code are you using as an author in your memoir? Not the other things you've written, but...
Well, for the memoir, it really is just, my experiences growing up as someone who as a young person, trying to figure out, where they fit into the world. I mean, in some ways, you could also say it's spoken from the perspective of a middle child, because I feel like that was one of the defining characteristics of my life was that, I was always that middle child who got sort of lost, who wasn't paid attention to. And I was truly trying to use that to my advantage, right, in terms of carving out a space for myself. And so I think that's what it is. It's about a young person trying to figure out who they are. So that would be the voice. It's a young person. So
that's cool. No, that makes a lot of sense. One of the excerpts I read was when your family took you to visit the tombs of your ancestors. I think it was called Tomb Sweeping Day. And that was really interesting because it was written obviously in great diction as an adult, but from the child's perspective of what the heck, I'm bringing gifts to give them to other people. I don't get to eat this amazing food. My son, just because it might come up, he's half Thai and half American, and the Thai is actually really from China. So he's DNA. If he took a 23andMe, he'd be Chinese, but he's Thai. And it's a similar culture. In my opinion, which is it's a community-oriented culture, like you said about last names, your first name is your last name, and it goes in a different order. So how do you feel about that? identity politics are so prominent in America now, and like your identity and it's always, the person of the year a couple of years ago was you, and we have the iPhone and YouTube and all these things. How do you feel about the two cultures, since you actually have a familiarity with the polar opposite of what most Americans are raised with?
Well, I mean, I don't see it as so stark as the way you're sort of presenting it. I
Okay,
feel like,
yeah.
as an Asian American, I feel like it's already blended in.
Mm.
Like for me, I don't go through that like, oh my God, well, which part is Asian and which part's American? Because I also think that these terms are fluid anyway, right? Like,
Hmm.
what does it mean to be Asian? Asia itself has been so influenced by Western culture these days, right?
Yeah.
That it's changed, but American culture, right, is so inclusive of people of color and Asian culture. I mean, like, you look at a drink like boba, right?
Hmm.
Are you going to say that that's strictly an Asian drink, or is it actually now an American drink? It's so ubiquitous. It's all over the place, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so I don't stick to those terminologies as I don't find them as useful for me. I go by the more fluid definitions of these things because I like it, and I think that's the exciting thing about these terms is that we can actually help change them and fuse different ideas into them.
I love that answer. And I think what I was trying to express was more about the like, think about your ancestors and think about the community before you think about yourself. Is that do you feel that because of the way you were raised, you have a better grip on that than the average American who wasn't introduced to that, or do you think that is a part of the whole overall American culture now?
Well, I think that there are certain cultures traditionally, that are, put more of an emphasis on the community versus the individual, right? I don't think it's just Asian cultures. I think there are other cultures too, that think about that. And so definitely, like within our family household, we definitely did focus on the family, how things impacted the families. You never really just made an individual decision without thinking of how it would impact other people as well.
Hmm.
And the perfect example would be like the coming out experience, which is in the book, is that, I never really worried that my parents were going to say, kick me out or disown me. They would never do that. Right.
Hmm.
Um, but I did worry about coming out to them because I didn't want to disappoint them. And I was worried about how it would impact them, and so coming out, in other ways in other communities, be like, I'm coming out. I'm going to be my own individual. Be damned. Everybody has to accept me. For who I am. But I don't know if I didn't approach it like that. And for me, it was a personal decision, but I needed to weigh in how it impacted my family, right?
Wow.
And so if that's what you're talking about, then yeah, maybe there's a little bit more of that. But I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's actually a good thing.
No, it sounds like a very good thing. Yeah, I think the main line of questioning that I'm asking on this particular subject, from
Mhm.
intersectionality to the last one, is more about your unique experience explained back
Mhm.
to other people who didn't have a chance for that, and then also to hear your thoughts reflected with theirs. So I mean, it's wonderful to hear your answers, and I'm really happy about them because something that's happened to me as I've gotten older in America, in particular, because I've traveled a lot, is I
Mhm.
feel a little bit sad about the hostility when people want to enter into a question oriented dialogue about these subjects. So like, I'll be in a room. I grew up in Oakland, California. And before like a person can even get the question out of their mouth, people start saying like, well, that was rude, that was offensive. Whereas the person's trying to get a hold on like subjects that they don't want to be offensive about. And so I think people like you who write memoirs and who do social justice work are really helping with that cause. Um, and it might sound like I'm shifting gears, but to me it's very related. You also are from Detroit, like you said, and you're from the time period of one of the most famous riots in American history. And
Mhm.
Detroit, it's not like its reputation is great today either. It's kind of,
Yeah,
yeah. So
it's getting better.
yeah, it
It's
is,
getting
and
better.
I love Detroit. I've only been twice, but I loved it. And also because I'm from Oakland, I feel like a kinship towards a city that a
Yeah.
lot of people just broadly brush over as like, oh, full of crime, gangs, not worth
Mhm.
visiting, scary. So how do you address that in particular, like violence and gangs and criminality and all that? How do you calm people down, so to speak, if that comes up?
I don't think I need to calm people down. That's not my job in life. I can
Nice.
only present my experiences. I mean, I joke about it probably. Like, so for instance, my husband and I live in downtown LA, but we've been living down here for over 20 years. And back then, Skid Row and crime was a much bigger issue, right? Before it started to gentrify.
Hmm.
And the first week we moved down here, I jokingly said, like, and the first week we moved down here, they found 2 dead bodies in a car. And I jokingly said, "Oh, I'm from Detroit. You need 3 dead bodies before I freak out." So I don't know. For me, that's just my experience. And I talk about it in the book. It's like I grew up in Detroit in the '80s. It was not just the auto industry that was struggling, but there was crack cocaine, there was AIDS. I knew 5 people murdered by the time I was 18 years old. That's just my childhood, right? I don't judge it as better or worse than anybody else. That's just the hand that my family was dealt, right?
Hmm.
And so, I don't feel I need to explain it to people. I do think that people are sort of surprised because they have certain assumptions about people, right?
Hmm.
Like based off of who they are, what they look like, and what experiences that they think these people have. But I mean, maybe that's a good thing, is that I can. Challenge or upend some of these assumptions that they have about people, about class, about race, about sexual orientation or whatnot, right?
Yeah, that's really
Hmm.
cool. Definitely. And yeah, I think I get defensive personally when people try to say that a city I've lived in and loved is a bad place and that it's got bad people. So I think that's where my question comes from. But I love your answer, and I think it also leads me to want to know more about um, what is your position and your end game with the social justice work you're doing. Like, obviously it's not the only thing you do with your life. You're married, you have other talents and other interests and stuff. So is there like a goal that you have in mind, like, well, once I achieve that I can relax, or I'm already relaxed and I've achieved it, anything like that?
You mean we have world peace already?
Yeah,
We're
that's
done.
exactly what I'm asking. Is world peace the ultimate goal, or do you think that's impossible?
Uh, no, I just want people to be nicer to each other. That's my
Cool.
only goal.
Yeah.
Just be nicer to each other. Just be friendlier, and give people. I mean, it's a very Buddhist idea, right? To just compassion. I don't know what religious background your spouse might have, but we're taught compassion, right? Just being more empathetic towards other people. And yeah, if like referring to an earlier question that you had, if someone has a question, don't necessarily assume that it's coming from a bad place. It might just be wanting to understand a situation, and they may not be the most articulate in terms of how they ask it, but they're trying. And I think that's what you have to give people credit for sometimes. And just understand that everything is about change, and we're all just trying to do the best we can. And I feel like as long as your intentions are good and you're headed in the right way, then I think that's okay, right?
Yeah, I like that, and I think
Hmm.
intentionality matters a lot. And that's
Hmm.
actually, we've kind of now gone into the real purpose of this podcast, which is it's a metaphysical podcast in which we want our guests to explain how much they do or don't think about death and how much that does or does not affect the way they live. So the first question we always ask is, what do you think is going to happen to you specifically when you die?
Hey everyone! If you're a fan of the show, please head over to mikeyop.com and click the subscribe button. It's the best way to support us, and it's free. That's MIKEYOPP.com. Thanks!
Well, I mean, do I feel in reincarnation or some? I mean, obviously there's a difference in the body, right? But I don't really think about it too much. I do feel like my energy that I'm, you know, uh, producing or contributing to this world, it does have an impact, right? We all do, right? Like for the time that we're here on the planet. How that manifests itself, or what is the ramifications of it, what's the domino effect of it, whatever. Hopefully, it's for good, and that's what I would say. Like that's what happens after I pass.
Cool.
Is like what is the impact I had while I was here?
And have you ever had like what someone would call a spiritual or a metaphysical experience, something that was impossible to define or that shook you and changed your world perspective?
No, I don't. I don't think so. You know. So now that I've finished this first book, right? People ask me what's the next book you're working on, and I actually think it's going to be what people call a grief memoir. because my parents were in a car accident a number of years ago, and my dad sadly passed away. And so I was the one who had to go back to Detroit to sell the family business, and that was probably a defining experience for me. I don't think it's quite what you're asking for, right? But it definitely, forced me to think about things, right? And connection to family and, history and legacy in some ways, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I'm sorry for your loss. That's terrible. And
No, thanks. Yeah.
that's from one writer to another. That is a great idea to write that book. I think that would really help a lot of people. I did work in hospice for a couple of years of my life, and it was very life shaping and changing. The same way yours experience was. It wasn't metaphysical or spiritual so much as just practicality meets my heart, And
Yeah, I want to write a book that's useful for myself, right? Because I have unresolved feelings about my dad's passing. Because to be frank, I mean, we weren't getting along, right before his passing. Not that we were like, like we hated each other. It just I was really annoyed, with my dad and a lot of decisions I was making in his life. So we still talked every week. I was just really frustrated with him. Maybe that's a better word. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I was frustrated with my dad. And so I feel like it would be good to write that book to sort of resolve this for myself. But then I sort of think like, well, what would a book like this be useful to people, right? Because when you're a writer, you're always trying to think of that aspect too, right? Like you're writing for yourself, but you're also writing for an audience. What would my experiences, what could it shed light on for people to help them with this? Is it because someone said this before, it's like, oftentimes when we write memoirs or when we write about victims or people who've passed, who are the bodies that we mourn, right? And oftentimes that image of who you mourn isn't necessarily an Asian man, right? Like oftentimes we're taught to mourn women, we're taught to mourn children. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Veterans, et cetera, but are you ever taught to mourn a Chinese waiter? Right. So there are different angles that I have to think about, like, well, what would someone like me and me writing a book, what are the additional benefits from it, right? Or openings that I can provide by sharing my particular story.
Yeah. Wow. That was a great answer. Thank you. And since we've talked about it a little bit, but not gotten into it, the name of your memoir, again, is Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant. So if I understand correctly, your parents, your father and your mother, owned and operated the first Chinese restaurant in Detroit. Is that correct?
No, it was the first Chinese restaurant in Detroit I think opened was like in 1910 or 12 or something like that. But this restaurant was founded by my great grandfather in 1940. So it wasn't an old school one, but I like to think of it as the best Chinese restaurant in Detroit.
Awesome.
And so what I always do is I always ask people to guess how many egg rolls we sold in the 65 years that we owned the business, and that'll give you a sense of how popular we were. So,
oh wow, 65 years of business, egg rolls.
Yeah.
I'm assuming 2 or 4 to an order. So, oh my gosh, I can't even. I'll just say 5 million.
We sold over 10 million egg rolls.
Oh my god,
that was a pretty good guess.
Yeah, but that was I was going high on purpose. That's an incredible number. I can't even wrap my head around it. That's awesome.
They were all handmade too by my grandma and my mom. So that's how I know the figures. But yeah, no. Some people will say like 8,000. I'm like, what? That's like a week, And some people will be like billions. I'm like, yeah, no. So yeah, no. But that was the restaurant that I grew up in. That's the setting of the of my memoir, right? It's like all the things I learned in that Chinese restaurant, things about life and people.
And is the restaurant still open?
No, sadly, when my dad passed away, I had to sell it.
Okay.
So.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you sold it to someone and then they closed it, or it just completely?
Yeah, we sold it to somebody and then they operated for a number of years. But then when COVID hit, they shut down during COVID.
Oh, that's sad. Yeah.
Yeah.
My brother wanted to ask you, this is a very important question. He said whenever he goes to a new Chinese restaurant, he lived in Queens for like 20 years, so he's really into food. And he says, what's the best Chinese food dish to order to test the restaurant to see like what its quality is?
I don't think there's a single one, right? Because every restaurant has its own specialty, right? Mm-hmm. That's the way it should be. I always like to ask restaurant owners, what's the most popular dish?
Okay. Cool.
as opposed to what's your favorite dish. Do you know what I mean? Just to sort of get a sense. And that's oftentimes not even like the best, estimate of like how good the food is, right? Because there's always things that are on the secret menu or whatnot. I just really try to have a rapport with whoever is serving, because, they will oftentimes divulge information to you. And the other thing that I will say about Chinese food too, or food in general, is that I'm actually okay, with okay food as long as the service is great.
Mhm.
But I won't do the opposite, right? Like if food is great but it's got sucky service, I won't go.
Yeah.
So for me, going out to a restaurant really isn't just about the food; it's the whole dining experience, right? It's about that hour and a half that you're spending in that space, and that is also including the interaction, with the waiters, right, and the managers and the
Yeah.
other customers, right? So it's not just going to defining what's a good restaurant isn't just about the food; it's about everything. It's
Yeah.
about the whole experience. Mhm.
I don't have your incredible experience, but I did manage restaurants for 10 years, and I absolutely agree. And my wife cringes every time we go to a restaurant if the service starts out shaky.
Oh my
She's like,
God,
oh
I get
no.
so tense.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you get really judgmental, right? Because you can criticize, like, why aren't they doing this? Like, if you're just passing by, why aren't you not looking at the table and see
Yeah.
if they need water refilled, right? These are not hard anyway. So yeah, I'm sure
Oh,
you and I
so
could give that for a long time.
Yeah, no,
yeah.
it's great. Yeah, and we didn't really talk about the AIDS crisis. How do you feel like now in modernity with like the AIDS crisis? Is it air quotes over? Is it something that we still need to talk about? I was born in 1981, so I was like the generation where we thought sitting on a toilet seat gave you AIDS. It was like embarrassingly horrible. And then yeah. So where are we?
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Oh, now you get into really philosophical discussions, right? Like, is anything really ever done?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Exactly.
Like, no, nothing is ever completely done. Things are always just, different flux and stuff like that. And so I don't think, the AIDS, to use the term crisis, maybe they don't use that term anymore, but people are still getting AIDS, people are still dying from it. Having been at the beginning of that, global, pandemic, or what you might want to call it, it was a really different time period, right? It really did shape my idea of like, thinking that I would be dead by the age of 30. Right? I really didn't think I had a long life.
Oh,
Well,
man.
think about it, right?
Yeah.
Like every time you saw somebody on TV that was gay, or who had it was a correlation, right? Like
Yep,
gay
totally.
equals AIDS, AIDS equals death. There was a direct line in that thinking. And so even if I saw anybody who's gay, even if you didn't think that they had AIDS, even if you didn't know if they had AIDS, you'd be like, oh, they will get AIDS. They will be dead soon.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It was that bad. And so, I think back on that time period, and I've talked to other people around my age, and a lot of them feel that they went through that same journey as well, right? And there's a certain amount of survivor, not guilt, but survivor's appreciation or something.
Okay. Feeling
Like, well, we made it through, and yet, we've had these great lives, and we've been able to contribute and give back in that way. So yeah, that was definitely a generational thing to pull back to, your original question.
Yeah.
But I think that the lessons of it are important. Particularly when you're looking at community, civil rights, people fighting back, and there is also a lot of parallels, even just with the recent COVID, years that we went through.
Oh, I definitely felt that. Yeah. It was very eye-opening to be in my late 30s, early 40s with COVID, because I was, like I said, a child with AIDS, but I did see an interesting parallel. But I want to get back to asking you questions. So another unfortunate ham-fisted segue, but recently there's been a lot of anti-Semitism in America, and that follows in the wake of a lot of what they call anti-Asian or Asian hate. And so as someone who's Jewish and someone whose son is Asian, I'm pretty darn psychologically affected by both. But I'm also aware that there's just a lot of hate in the world, and there's hate against a lot of different groups, and it's not that we're special or being targeted. However, I am curious, do you feel like America is currently wrapping its head around this and we're improving, or do you think we're very much in the early stages of something that needs more focus and attention, specifically hate against minorities?
Well, I'm an eternal optimist. I think the other thing too is that people from roughly my years to your years, we sort of grew up in a certain window, right, in American history or even world history. Because if you talk to people, who are older than us, and they talk about, like, what America was like beforehand, with the KKK and all these other, hate groups around, they were really prominent. So can you really say that what we're going through is worse than what they went through?
Yeah.
Definitely when we had slavery, or definitely when we, rounded up all the Native Americans, or when we threw the Japanese Americans into, incarcerated them. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
those things were far worse than what we're going through now. So maybe, we've taken a few steps back, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that overall we're still making progress, right? I do think that, sadly, I do think that hate will always be around. You're never going to completely eradicate it, but what the goal is to be able to respond to it when it does happen, and also to send a message to people who may otherwise be driven by it, to know that it's wrong, right?
Yeah.
And so those are the things that we can work on, and in that sense, I do think that. Our country's in a much better place, and the ability of communities to sort of respond to these things is much, much better. I know for Jewish Americans, it seems like, your community has a long history in the U.S. of fighting for civil rights, right? For our community as Asian Americans, it's taken us a little while to build that same infrastructure that your community has had, right? If you think back to like the 80s, when I was growing up, we didn't have anything. When one of our family friends was murdered in a hate crime, there was no media to cover it. There were no politicians to speak out against it. There were no celebrities to use social media to elevate it. There wasn't a national network of nonprofits to advocate, right? We had nothing, right? And so flash forward 40 odd years later, when the rise of anti-Asian hate was happening during COVID, at least our community was able to respond and raise awareness about it. So people talked about it, right?
Yeah.
And that alone is a victory to me, right? And so in that sense, I know our community as Asian Americans have gotten much better. I know that, my sense is, for Jewish Americans, again, because you guys have a longer history of fighting it. I mean, it's too bad that there seems to be like this backslide, right? Where it's like, it seemed like for a few, couple decades, it seemed like people didn't talk about anti-Semitism much, right? Because there hadn't been any high-profile cases or anything like that. But then, now you realize that, that stuff has always been there, will always be there. And now, you actually have Nazis walking in the streets again of America. I mean, so, but how is that different than when the KKK used to ride around, in their hoods? So I don't,
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's fascinating to hear you explain it that way. It's interesting because I have such a warped perspective, because I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area in the 80s. So I grew up immersed with Asian culture, and we were taught in school about the railroad. We were taught in school about the internment camps. We had speakers come who were in the internment camps, which I know is Japan, but it's still Asian. And so it's just interesting because I felt my mind was blown when I left home for college and went to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and there were like very few Asians there, very few Jewish people, and I'm not, so anyway, my heart kind of breaks.
I think just sometimes taking a step back, because oftentimes when we think about our current situation, our frame of reference is really the personal experiences we've had, right? And sometimes that's quite limited. But if you take a step back, whether it's through history or geography, have a more expansive, then I think that sometimes maybe that makes you feel better, right? Because then you don't feel as bound in by that, or like,
No, that's great. I really appreciate your tone. I appreciate what you're trying to do on Earth. I appreciate you, and I really like the way you guide. Even in my questioning, you're guiding people towards self-reflection, patience, and tolerance, and I just could not appreciate it more. That's really what I want to do with my life, is help people achieve what you have clearly achieved in your life. So thank you, Curtis. I always give my guests an opportunity to just kind of have the floor at the end of the interview. So is there anything you want to add? There will be links and everything to find your book and your other works.
No, my catchphrase that I like to say is that even though I don't work in a Chinese restaurant anymore, I live my life as if I'm a Chinese waiter. That means I go around asking people, how can I help you? What can I get you? How can I make your life a little bit better? I think that's a good way to sort of live life. Is like, how can you make other people's lives just a little bit better, no matter how little time you're spending with that person?
Wow, I love it. Thank you so much, Curtis. This has been a really fun interview for me, and I wish you immense success in the future. And to everyone listening at home, thank you again for tuning in to Coffin Talk. Again, the best way to support the show is to head over to MikeyOpp.com. That's MIKEYOPP.com, and sign up for the free weekly philosophical humorous newsletter. To everyone listening, again, my name is Mike Oppenheim. You've been listening to Coffin Talk with Curtis Chin, and we will see you soon.